Well, hello out there everyone. I'm happy to say that your favorite 8 and 16-bit Sega review channel, Zilog and Moto, has officially returned for year 6. Okay, so maybe it's not your favorite Sega channel, but it is at least a Sega channel. There is no denying that. When looking at the planned episode schedule that I have, I didn't have anything in this particular slot, which was nice, because it allowed me to pick exactly how I wanted to start out 2024. And I thought, well, what better way than to take my first look at one of Sega's most legendary series of games, which I hadn't touched so far in the previous 223 episodes. Which is how I decided on Shinobi for the Master System, a game and actually a whole series of games that I really don't know a whole lot about, with the exception of its direct sequel, Revenge of Shinobi, which I put a lot of hours in back in the day. I still have nightmares about that one labyrinth level toward the end. Ugh. Anyway, for those of you out there that don't know me and just randomly got dropped here by the algorithm, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I am out to collect and review not just ports of big-name Sega arcade titles that would arguably get more popular after the series started appearing on home consoles, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at the original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, you might think that I'm taking a bit of a shot at Shinobi by saying that it got more popular after the series started appearing on home consoles, but let me ask you a question. Have you ever actually played the original Shinobi arcade machine? And I'm sure there's plenty of you out there that have. It was apparently a popular game, getting ported to numerous non-Sega consoles that I'll discuss in a bit. But honestly, was it on the level of Ultra Beast, Outrun, or the recently discussed on the channel Golden Axe? I mean, maybe at one point in certain regions, but it certainly didn't seem to have the staying power of some of those bigger name games. And that's even reflected on KLOV's rarity and popularity rankings, with the game only rating a 12 out of 100 on member want lists. I personally don't ever recall seeing the arcade machine back in the day, which I'm just going to chalk up to being replaced by more popular and newer machines by the time that I really started going to the arcades a lot in the early 90s. I mean, maybe it was there and I just always went to Double Dragon instead. I mean, who knows? The point I'm trying to get across is while Revenge of Shinobi, Shadow Dancer, and to a lesser extent Shinobi 3 carried the series once the 16-bit era began, I think, at least in the United States, the original Shinobi is a bit more of a forgotten game, whether you were talking about that original arcade version or the Master System version. And I'd argue that probably the NES version from Tengen, of all things, is probably what most people in the United States know the game from, if they know it at all, with that version being unlicensed. And again, I completely expect Europe to have a different opinion on this, seeing as how the game was also ported to all of the usual 8 and 16-bit home computers of the time, and of course that NES port doesn't exist over there. Ultimately though, regardless of popularity, I'm looking at two main things in today's review. Is Shinobi on the Master System a good game, and does it represent the arcade version well? Well, I'll get into all that and more, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Shinobi for the Master System. Nothing weird this week, no having to buy multiple copies of the game because something was screwed up with the game or the packaging. Just the copy of Shinobi that I bought at least 5 years ago. I've had it for a long time, so long that I don't remember when I picked it up, which I assume is probably going to start becoming more normal the longer I collect and do these reviews, and get older. This is specifically the North American version, as you would be able to tell when we get to the back of the package and the manual, but ultimately both the North American and European versions look pretty similar, with the same artwork and screenshot layouts used on both. If I had to describe the condition of this particular copy, I'd go with well-loved, in that it's not beat up too badly, but it's also clearly seen better days, with the hang tab removed at the top and some scuffing and gouging to the outer cover. I think I'm okay with holding on to this particular copy, but if I did want to replace it for some reason,
The US version is still pretty available, currently going for about $30 to complete, and then the European version also selling for a few dollars cheaper on average. As far as the front cover goes, I think it's pretty solid. With the game coming out in September of 1988, Sega had gotten away from the cartoony, simplistic early cover art for the Master System titles and started to be a bit more adventurous. Not that this particular art is too complex either, but you at least get the feel from Joe Musashi's facial expression that this is a serious action title. The Japanese version, unsurprisingly, has much better artwork, at least for the front cover, but with Shinobi, I don't feel like the cover that we got was bad. But man, that Japanese art is just cool. I really wish I understood what the marketing people were thinking when doing their own art. I understand that you have to pay the artist more, but I mean, come on. Flipping over the back, and we've got 4 screenshots, all of decent quality, and all showing different levels of action in the game, so good job there by Sega. I especially like how the second shot shows off the fact that the first-person levels from the arcade game have been retained for this port. The flavor text over the side appears to be somewhat on the brief side, which is a little surprising, but it's still more than what Europe would have gotten with the multi-language version. What we do have is interesting. We've got first either a typo or translation issue right off the bat in the second line, with main character Joe Musashi having his first name just spelled as Joe and then a hyphen where the E is supposed to be. You know it's always good when you misspell the main character's name in marketing, let me tell you. I do like the hype of this other line here though. When duty calls, you're a master ninja. Ah, yeah. Down below this next section, they're waiting for you with gunmen, thugs, Mongos, and green ninjas. Wait, Mongos? Like Mongo from Blazing Saddles? Steve Mongo McMichael, the Bears, and the Four Horsemen? I'm not sure I know what a Mongo is, but I guess I'm fighting it. Opening up the package, and for some odd reason, I've got 2 copies of the manual. I should probably get rid of one of them with my other duplicates. Anyway, the manual starts out with a bit more exposition on the plot and spells Joe's name correctly, thankfully, and then follows up with how to play and some nice original artwork. Flipping to the back, and there's some more art of enemies that you'll be up against, and oh, I guess the shield ponytail guy is a Mongo. Well, that settles that. I'm sure most people would be able to play Shinobi without the manual, but with all the information that's in here, it's definitely a better experience if you have it. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game itself and see how the OG Shinobi stacks up. Shinobi as a concept first appeared in the arcades in late 1987, running on System 16 hardware. Regardless of how popular Shinobi may or may not have been in the arcades, Sega decided it was a good candidate to help bolster their software library on home consoles, and with the System 16-based Mega Drive not quite ready in Japan yet, Sega decided on a Master System version of the game instead, and handed off the production to the famous Sega R&D 2, who was already very familiar with the Master System hardware, with the hope that they could get the most out of the significantly lower-powered console. The decision proved to be wise, as Shinobi was a legitimate hit, selling well for the Master System in the fall of 1988, and giving the struggling US Master System user base something that they could hold over NES owners, and flip the script of having a game that, for once, they couldn't play. At least for the time being in the United States. In fact, it appears, and I could be wildly wrong about this, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments, that the popularity of the Master System version of the game, and not the arcade original, is what prompted later ports to other consoles and 8 and 16-bit computers. Now, again, I could be wrong, and perhaps Sega was so desperate for an exclusive title that had the opportunity to move some consoles that maybe they just refused to license the game to other third parties for a period of time. But it's very interesting that despite the fact that Shinobi first appeared in arcades in 1987, that none of the non-Sega ports of the game would come out until well after the release of the Master System version, with the home computer, PC Engine, and NES versions not coming out until almost 1990 in some cases. As far as those ports of the game go, as you might imagine, they are of varying quality due to the wide disparity of the underlying hardware involved, but if I've got to be honest, the vast majority of those non-Sega ports range from mediocre to awful. You might assume that the Amiga and Atari ST versions specifically would hold up, due to both being Motorola 68000 based like the System 16, but they are shockingly bad, with poor frame rates and some very ugly palette choices. And I'd honestly say that the Commodore 64 version is probably the version to play for the non-consoles. Just to wrap up the port discussion before getting into the actual review of the Master System version, it should be mentioned that the PC Engine version is the class of all of them, and was easily the best port of the game at the time. That leaves the NES port from Tengen, and for an unlicensed title, it's actually not a bad port, and somewhat comparable to the Master System version. But as usual for games that appeared on both the Master System and the NES, the Master System version is clearly the better of the two, and I'd honestly say that out of all the ports of the game, the Master System version is only behind that PC Engine port, which is pretty good considering how much earlier it hit the market. Now that all that background is out of the way, let's get into the game itself. If you're not familiar with Shinobi or the Shinobi series, it's the story of Joe Musashi and his fight against the Zed criminal organization, who has taken to kidnapping the children of Joe's clan, which of course doesn't sit well with Joe, and he's out to rescue all the kids and take down Zed once and for all. Or at least that's the plot of the arcade version. While Zed would eventually return in the form of Neo Zed, the antagonist of Revenge of Shinobi, for the purposes of Shinobi on the Master System, Zed was instead removed and replaced with the Ring of Five. And now, rather than the children of your clan members, the Ring of Five have gone global and kidnapped the children of world leaders, I guess in an attempt to up the emotional stakes, and explain why there's 5 specific bosses that Joe is targeting in the process of completing his rescue mission. Ultimately, the story changes don't really affect the game at all, but I do find it interesting that Zed was removed just to be inserted back into the next game. With there being 5 bosses in the Ring of Five, logically there are different missions in the game that are divided into several individual rounds. For some reason, the first mission in the game has 2 traditional action rounds where you're combating various enemies in an attempt to rescue the kids, and then a boss round. But then missions 2 through 5 all have 3 action rounds and a boss round. I'm not real clear on why that is, as it's a bit weird for just the first mission to be different, but if I was to put my tinfoil hat on, I'd say it stems from Sega wanting to draw arcade players in by making the first mission easier than all the others, and having them think that if they just dropped in a few more quarters, they'll be able to beat the game. Absolutely devious, I tell you. And just to be clear, while yes, there have been some tweaks to the gameplay as far as the Master System port is concerned, it's largely the same game, with all the same levels and structure from the arcade, and the level design is similar as well. So Sega R&D 2 didn't cut any corners when it came to trying to reflect the experience of playing the arcade game, just on simpler hardware. If someone wanted to simply play a home version of Shinobi in 1988, Sega had you covered, with a few tweaks to the gameplay that honestly made sense for a home version of the game and expanded things to compensate for the fact that there are no continues in the Master System version. I'll discuss the no continues issue in a moment, but I do want to go over the additions quickly. In the arcade version of Shinobi, Joe was able to be taken down by one-hit kills, so the immediately noticeable change to the game was to grant Joe a life bar, which can be upgraded and restored by rescuing children. Rescuing children also allows you to upgrade your shurikens up to 4 times, allowing Joe to max out by carrying a gun. Because, I know I remember that famous 80s Jackie Chan movie, Ninja with a Gun, don't you? Along with having your projectile weapon upgraded, rescuing kids can also have your melee weapon upgraded 3 times as well, give a points bonus, which is important since you can gain extra lives in lieu of no continues, and finally allow entrance into the first-person shooting gallery type bonus level from the arcade version. The bonus level features the last major change from the arcade version. One of the selling points of Shinobi was Joe's ability to use ninja magic in his battle against Zed, or the Ring of Five, to tip the battle in your favor. In the arcade version, you would automatically have the ability to use one of 3 ninja magics that acted similar to using a bomb attack in a shooter that would clear the screen of enemies when things get desperate. One of those special attacks was automatically provided to the player, and if you were to survive the bonus screen, you'd get an extra life. For the Master System version, the magic system has been revamped, and I'm not convinced that I like it. 3 new magic attacks were added to the game, in addition to the existing 3, and now Joe potentially has the ability to paralyze enemies, fly briefly, or even be invincible for the rest of the stage. In theory, more is definitely better, but the problem is now how Joe gets access to the magic. By default, Joe no longer has any magic, and has to earn it by surviving the bonus screen, which is not the easiest thing in the world. Unlike the additions to the health and weapon systems, this seems to be a bit unnecessary, and I think I would have preferred that they left it alone and allowed the player to win an extra life instead. You can earn up to 4 magic attacks, which is nice, so it's not all bad, but with as important as the magic system is to later games, especially in Revenge of Shinobi, the way it's presented here, a player could theoretically go through the game without using it at all, and that just feels like it removes a large portion of what makes Shinobi Shinobi. Circling back to the no continues issue, oftentimes in Master System ports of arcade games, Sega would provide options to continue, which sometimes would be noted in the manual, and then sometimes not, providing another reason to keep up with your manuals. Shinobi not having continues is an exception to this rule, but thankfully Sega at least provided one of the easier level select codes that I've ever seen. So for players that want to practice the more difficult levels without having to go through the beginning of the game, or that simply want to try to skip to the end to see everything in the game, that option is built in. Now, I could see some people scoffing at this and disregarding it with a get good type comment, but I ask, what better way to practice and get good is there than to be able to go straight to the scenario that's giving you trouble that clearly needs practice and memorization? And honestly, I really don't want to hear it, with Exhibit A being level 5-2 and the ridiculous flying ninjas that almost teleport directly into you. Get past that level and then come talk to me about getting good. As far as the graphics go, Shinobi looks pretty great, considering it's trying to cram all of the action of the arcade game down into only 2 megabits of storage space on the cartridge. I already mentioned how it compares to the other ports of the game, but one of the key things about Shinobi is not necessarily how close it gets to emulating the look of the arcade game, but how well the game runs. A note that Amiga and Atari ST programmers probably should have taken. Of course, the sprites in the game are smaller, but all of the characters in the game and the backgrounds are colorful and detailed, and everything does resemble the arcade version. For an 8-bit home version of an arcade game in 1988, I don't think you could ask for much more. The sound in Shinobi is solid. I wouldn't say it's the best soundtrack that I've heard on the Master System, but it's pretty good. It's limited in the fact that there's really only a few different tracks, with one being used for any level that's not a boss level, and then one for the boss levels. But what is there sounds good. And this might be a controversial take, but honestly, the sound effects in the arcade version are pretty rough, so I actually prefer the sound effects that are in the Master System version, believe it or not. Shinobi is also one of the Master System titles that supports an FM soundtrack, if you have the ability to play it back. But like every game that I've reviewed so far that has both PSG and FM soundtracks, your mileage will vary if you actually prefer it or not. Unlike previous titles where I would say the soundtrack is better on the FM version, but the sound effects are better on the PSG version, in the case of Shinobi, I don't think there's really as much difference in the quality of the soundtracks, and the sound effects are closer in both versions as well, so it truly comes down to user preference. But if you're just playing on a vanilla Master System or Genesis hardware, you're still in for a good experience regardless. Playing Shinobi this week was a fun time. Unlike a lot of the Master System games that I review on the channel, I had actually played this before. It's just been a few years, and I didn't play it very much. so actually getting to put a few hours into it this week was nice. It holds up extremely well compared to the arcade game, and was certainly a portent of future games to come, with Revenge of Shinobi coming not too far off into the future. The game does have a few rough points, such as hiding ninja magic behind the bonus stages, no continues, losing all your power-ups when you die, not having your health refilled between levels, and one of the worst power-ups I've seen in recent memory in the grenade. But even with all those drawbacks, I've still got to award Shinobi 3 stars. It can be a difficult game for sure, but it's a solid arcade experience in the home that didn't have many peers at the time.
Okay, and that is it for Shinobi for the Master System. I'm not gonna lie, I did use that level skip code more than a few times when playing and capturing footage for the review this week, but by the time I sat down to write the review, I could easily get into Mission 4 without much trouble. But just be warned, other than that final boss, the game's difficulty really spikes up in level 5 too. And honestly, that level being as patently unfair was definitely something that I held against it. I'm not sure that I would have given it 4 stars even had that level been handled better, due to my issues with the magic system, but if I had to point out one big issue I had with the game, that's it. Good luck if you're going to try it yourself is all I can say. Next time on Zilog and Moto, since this was a pretty well-known game, it's time to go to something that not as many people care about, unfortunately, which means it's sports time again. Yay! It's time to finally start taking a look at a series that consists of 8 sports titles, with 4 coming on the Genesis and 4 on the Sega CD, and covering 5 different sports in total. For this first game, I'm honestly not expecting much, especially since I'm sure I've already played and reviewed better games in the genre, but maybe, just maybe, I'll find something that's a bit of a diamond in the rough. Or it could be a total waste of time, who knows, but that's why I do the reviews. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 224. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!